Welcome to the Crazy Wisdom Podcast. My guest today is Delian Asparouhov. He is the co-founder and president of Varda. And first, quick question: did I pronounce your last name right?
Yeah, close enough. It's Asparouhov, but it's all
Asparouhov.
kind of sort of fake. Anyways, given that the nobody, no American can pronounce the real Bulgarian pronunciation.
Yeah.
Say,
Welcome to the show.
thanks so much for having me.
Okay, I've wanted to interview for a really long time, and then you and your team put up a sort of a space laboratory up into space, satellite laboratory into space. Is that what you call it? Do you call it a satellite laboratory? What do you call it?
Yeah, we always sort of use different terminology, but yeah, that's not a totally unreasonable one. Early on, I would call them sort of space factories to sort of give it a bit of a quip. But yeah, realistically, it is sort of more of a space bio laboratory.
And so you're building crystals, or you're growing crystals. What do you call it there?
Yeah, I mean, depends on how one would characterize the process. You could call it precipitating or growing crystals, but yeah, basically forming crystalline structures of pharmaceuticals in the microgravity environment of orbit.
Yeah, and why? What about it in space allows us to do this better up there?
Um, you can kind of the analogy that I like to use for sort of broad audiences is you can think about sort of pharmaceutical manufacturing in some ways as the equivalent of sort of cooking in your kitchen, where you have various appliances, you have a bunch of ingredients, and in some ways you can actually create a semi-infinite sort of number of combinations, and there are certain ingredients that are appropriate for sort of certain appliances, sort of, let's say. And all that microgravity does is it sort of introduces an additional knob onto your oven effectively, where traditionally with your oven, you were able to shift how long something was in the oven, you could shift what temperature that it was at, and we're basically introducing another knob, which is you can shift how much gravity you basically are introducing into the chemical process. And introducing gravity or introducing microgravity just opens the scope of the results that are possible from your cooking. Some of those are going to be good, some of those are not going to be good, some of those are going to be the exact same, and it's kind of depending on the particular sort of recipe that you're making. Gravity can affect it in a significant sort of way. The reason that it basically affects it is inside of a gravity field, when you have basically density differences, so things that are less dense or more dense in either a gas or a liquid in a container, the less dense things basically rise to the top, the denser things move down. And so this shows up in practice in a lot of different ways in your day-to-day life. As an example of in this bottle of Fiji, I actually had a ice cube. That basically what would happen is that ice cube would float to the top. The reason being that ice is less dense than the water around it. Basically take this same bottle of Fiji, put the ice cube in it, mix it all up, and we're in the microgravity environment of space. The ice will just like float randomly, basically in the middle of the water, because again, there is no up, there is no down, and so even though it's less dense, and so imagine you had a, let's say, sort of pharmaceutical reaction where you needed a bunch of basically perfectly placed ice cubes in a really large vat of water, and it needs to be perfectly homogeneous. Great, you can do that. Or an even simpler way of thinking about this is like think of oil and vinegar, right? The reason that they separate is because there's density differences. Again, imagine that you needed a perfectly homogeneous, basically, mixture of oil and vinegar, and you needed it to sit there for 2 hours. On Earth, you cannot do that without constantly stirring it and basically disturbing the chemical process. Up there, mix it once, it's perfectly homogeneous, and again, no gravity, so density differences don't matter. And so a ton of different ways that you can basically change chemical reactions. And then, on a case by case basis, you're trying to basically solve a particular, sort of problem. You might be trying to solve whether a drug is, sort of shelf stable, whether it's soluble in the bloodstream, whether it has a toxic solvent, sort of loaded into it. You basically can use gravity as a knob to affect the chemical reaction to get an outcome that you want. And that definitely requires sort of like process engineering along the way. But yeah, that's maybe sort of extended explanation of you basically go up there because you can get different results than you can down here. Again, sometimes they're better, sometimes they're not, and it's not like default good. You need to like do a lot of engineering to make it good. Just like one would have to engineer a recipe on like what temperature is good. You kind of got to bake the cake probably 15 times, sometimes at 200 degrees, sometimes 220, 240, 260, and figure out where does it rise and where does it have like the nice caramelized top. Sort of same thing with gravity.
Brilliant. Okay, so many places. The question that keeps on coming in my mind is, who are the people who discovered this science? How did it go from the science to the laboratory to your company?
Yeah. Definitely not, sort of our idea. There's even papers from the sort of early 60s, I want to say, even before there was much activity up in orbit, theorizing about the potential of, sort of this type of work. There's even photos of, the current NASA administrator, Bob Nelson, on one of the earliest space shuttle missions, doing a protein crystallization experiment up in microgravity.
Wow.
That type of work continued on the, sort of Skylab, and then obviously the International Space Station once that was assembled in the late 90s. And then even sort of major biopharma companies, so Merck, Bristol Myers Squibb, Eli Lilly, Janssen and Janssen, probably several others that I'm not able to name off the top of my head, have all done significant sort of work on the International Space Station. To date, that work has always been at a very small scale, experimental, sort of scale, partially because, the sort of access to orbit, cadence in orbit, the capabilities that were, sort of possible on the, sort of pre-existing, let's say, microgravity laboratory equipment was all pretty limited, more meant as like sort of proof of concept. The whole idea behind Varda was now that, SpaceX had made it so that rockets were reusable, this type of work could now finally be commercialized. And so, our goal was to improve the cadence of how often these laboratories would fly, make them much more cost effective by removing all the humans. And so doing this, entirely independently of a government run space station. And then also, sort of make those laboratories sort of much more, sort of capable, try to match basically commercial terrestrial laboratories in terms of, capability versus, I'd say some of the, early laboratory equipment was much more unsophisticated up in microgravity. Partially, you just can't take like traditional equipment and just ship it up there. Again, in the microgravity environment, some of these machines may rely on gravity just to mix fluids together inside of a beaker. In microgravity, everything has to be pumps, microfluidics. You ultimately have to deal with the fact that you're in that environment, and then also you have to make sure that it survives the environment of launch and reentry. And so our laboratory equipment obviously looks very, very different than what you would see in a normal terrestrial laboratory.
Wait, did you have to construct it to customize all the laboratory equipment? Or
Oh
was
yeah, I mean, there's not like a laboratory equipment you
yeah.
can buy off the shelf that works in space, right? So in some ways, you can think of Varda as like we both have pharmaceutical, scientists and
Yeah,
process
interesting. Yeah.
engineers that are like the recipe, optimizers, because our customers don't know how to deal with the gravity knob, so we have to help them think through for their drug, for their problem set, how does the gravity knob basically help? Then we basically have pharmaceutical, and aerospace engineers working on laboratory equipment effectively. And we basically we know what it needs to be able to do, in that we just match what you can do commercially off the shelf terrestrially. But again, we have to optimize it for microgravity, for launch, for reentry. We have to make it so that, when we're reentering, the, surface of the heat shield is above the surface of the sun, but inside we actually keep the, pharmaceutical products in the lab at, below room temperature. And so you have to deal with those thermal problems. So we have a whole side of the company that is, working on that. And then, by the way, we have to build our own, satellites, reentry capsules, have to integrate them with rockets, et cetera. And so it's sort of like a pharmaceutical recipe team, pharmaceutical laboratory team, and then like space team, sort of all in one, because that's the only way to really serve our customers end to end. They just want to come to us with a drug product and a problem, and we solve that problem.
Hopefully, and of course, if this is confidential, no worries. Do you guys have customers
Yeah, we do have several publicly traded, sort of biotech companies as customers. Hoping to announce them, sort of relatively soon.
Great. And so, okay, so brilliant. It sounds really fun. It sounds like you're having a lot of fun with these different.
I don't know about if I'd use
no?
fun as the adjective, but
well, because
working.
I mean, there's excitement, right?
Yeah. I think you're just catching me in this sort of transition from chapter 1 to chapter 2 sort of moment of the company, where in some ways I always say a kid can be promising, an adult cannot, right? A kid can be promising based off their future work. An adult is ultimately graded by their resume, and so we're no longer a kid. We landed the capsule, we demonstrated, we are now an adult. And we need to now go do this on behalf of customers and go do this regularly and solve their problems. And obviously, we have not yet done that. And so we're in this transition phase where we no longer have the sort of wonder of being a kid, but also as an adult, we have not yet sort of accomplished our goals.
So it was my fun. It was my fun being the kid, like hearing about this awesome thing that I'm getting into. You're dealing with the actual stress of actually putting fucking space factories into orbit. Uh,
Exactly. Once I have solved a problem for a customer, maybe then I'll be happy again. I'm
yeah,
also,
interesting.
more, I think other people on the team are a little better at, enjoying the fun of it all throughout. I tend to just be obsessed with the, sort of next step of what we need to do.
And how hard was it to just like the so you had to get permission because you did the thing, you put it up there, and then you had to get permission from the FEC or FCC. What was the name of the regulatory?
FAA, Federal
FAA.
Aviation Administration. Yeah.
FAA. And what is it like to engage with a government bureaucracy? Did you have to like set a formal pattern, or like what was that like?
Yeah, we engaged with sort of regulators in the very early days of the sort of company within a few months of starting, basically with like, hey, this is the operation that we would like to do. Here's the regulatory framework you guys have in place for that. We would like to start operating within that sort of framework. It obviously took a bit longer than expected. We actually sort of made it to orbit and did not yet have the permission to come back down. Funnily enough, actually just yesterday, the FAA now launched an official notice that reentry vehicles are no longer allowed to go to space without their license to come back down. They do not want to deal with the stranded sailor problem that they had with Varda, basically ever again. That is definitely sort of challenge not only with that regulator, but also it's a sort of multi-party coordination problem where you're coordinating with the sort of regulator, the landing range, the basically military that you work with, and then also for our first four missions, we're working with this commercial partner, Rocket Lab, that actually develops a satellite bus and has the propulsion on board, and that propulsion is ultimately what brings us back down. And so this multi-party complex engagement that had also never been done before was, in some ways a lot more of the challenge than specifically the like going through the regulatory framework, if that makes sense. In that, the Cape Canaveral, the Cape Space Force, that range plus the FAA, they work together all day, every day, all the time. They know each other, clear communication channels, etc. That does not really exist yet for reentry on U.S. soil. We were the first, sort of company to do, reentry within the contiguous, United States. SpaceX does all their.
Was
Okay.
it considered to reentry in another country? Is that possible, or
Not for this first mission. Basically, like we
yeah?
went up with a sort of waiver that required us to come down within the United
Oh,
States. But
interesting.
yeah, in future missions, we will likely land some of them outside of the United States. In particular, we have this partnership with Southern Launch in Australia as a part of their Canuba test range, where we expect to land.
I would love to turn into a conversation about satellites in general, because I know
Sure.
you know this, maybe my listeners don't know this, that one of the key reasons that what you're doing is possible, you mentioned it, which is that SpaceX has now created a space economy outside of the government. And so that allows a bunch of people to just, put things into space. And there's been new types of propulsion. There's been new types of just like thinking about how to put things in space. And so there's now this like economy that's going. And which country are you most excited about in terms of regulation in terms of space?
Well, I think the words excitement and regulation are not ones that I would necessarily put together. I mean, in some ways, space is still such a, sort of, even though, SpaceX is built obviously these private, sort of rockets, anything that is done in space is sort of heavily scrutinized and regulated. And so in some ways, as a US based company, we have no option but to operate basically from within the United States. And also all other countries right now relative to the United States are basically a rounding error in space. If you look at basically, sort of mass to orbit, if you ignore Russia and China, obviously they're doing stuff, but like, China drops second stage or first stage, rockets onto like villages and kills people. So
Whoa.
I'm not sure that they're really thinking about, sort of regulation very much. They just launched their rockets and then they like drop the first stage on people. And that's obviously not something that we do in the United States.
Wow. And
Yeah,
that's
it's
why
kind
it
of
was
crazy.
important to get the regulation. This is the hard part about. That's why it was important to get the regulatory approval of the FAA, because they want to make
Yeah, it's
sure
like it's
nobody
risk
gets
to
hit.
human life,
Yeah, yeah,
obviously. Yeah, like
interesting.
we're bringing a like very heavy thing from outer space and landing it. We don't want that sort of landing in somebody's house and sort of killing them. Obviously in China they don't care about that, and so they obviously don't
What
really.
about
It's hard. There's no the word regulation in China don't really coincide or coalesce, let's say,
yeah?
and sort of same thing is basically true of Russia. But if you ignore China and Russia and you look at sort of mass to orbit, I mean the United States Q4 2023 was like 99.9999% of mass to orbit. So it's like there's not really like you're asking me a question about like what other country. It's like, well, there aren't even other countries doing anything, so
So
it's really just the United
so
States.
the India thing, because I know about like 6 months or so, India announced that they did something in space, right?
Totally, totally. Yeah,
Mhm.
if I'm remembering, they did a lander on the moon. What am I
Yeah, something to
misremembering?
do
Yeah,
with
I'm pretty
yeah.
sure they landed a lander on the moon. For sure. I mean, there's interesting things happening there.
But in terms of
It's not to like
business, yeah,
discount what they're accomplishing,
yeah.
but again, 99.99997% of mass to orbit in Q4 2023 was the United States. So it's like, I hope and I wish them all well. And obviously, Europe has a burgeoning,
Mm,
space economy that used to actually be the equivalent to the United States, and now is sort of more of a rounding error. I'm not sure that sort of continent is going to get their act together. They prefer to regulate rather than innovate most of the time, and so
yeah.
I'm just kind of skeptical that anything other than the United States is going to really matter over the next 10 to 15 years.
So you said 99.90%, 97% of mass space, I believe. What's the term you used?
Sorry, mass to orbit. So
Mass
just
to
like
orbit. You got it. Got it. Okay.
total mass of things going to orbit.
How
Number
much
of.
how
Okay.
much space do we have out there? Pun intended. At what point do we fill up the sky with things floating in space?
Likely, not in the next 1,000 years.
Yeah.
In that, if you think about it, look at the surface of the Earth, right? There are many
Yeah.
places. I'm
Yeah.
not sure if you ever like, I fly my small plane around. The United States has many times where I'll be, in a plane, and I look in all directions, and there's literally nothing built by humanity in any direction.
Yeah.
Now let's imagine space. Space is just as large as the surface of the Earth, but at many altitudes, right? So you have, at 100-kilometer altitude, or 500-kilometer altitude, there is size that is the, crust of the Earth that obviously is mostly empty, given that everything in space is way, way less than the number of things we've built on Earth. And then, by the way, space has altitudes at 500, at 600, at 700, at
Yeah.
800, at 1,000 kilometers.
Uh-huh.
So space is very, 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 very large and very, very, very empty.
And what is the furthest thing out that is useful to humans, if you happen to know?
I guess depends on how you define the word useful, but functioning,
Mhm.
it would be the Voyager spacecraft that we launched in, sort of 1971, I want to say, that at this point are like 12 billion miles away from
So, and I didn't mean that was geostationary. So surrounding, so furthest thing away, like what I'm really asking for is what is the limit at which it's close enough to Earth to be useful, but also far enough away that it kind of gives me a range to understand the first question I asked.
Oh, I guess like the Lagrangian points. The Lagrangian points are basically points where the effects of gravity are basically zeroed out between like the Earth and the sun, basically.
Whoa.
And so you're basically, if you think of like
Oh.
gravity wells, right? We're inside of the gravity well of the Earth. At some point, you start to dip over, and now you're actually in the gravity well of the sun. And then there's that like tip
Oh.
point where
Yeah.
you're at that tip
Interesting.
and you're actually basically right in between basically the two where you can tip over into either side. Those are
Yeah.
very useful like outposts or like sort of waypoints basically. And so I actually don't know this off the top of my head. Earth distance to, let's say, like L1, it's about 1.5 million kilometers.
Wow. Whoa. Okay. Yeah. So there's a lot of
Yeah,
space up there. Uh,
it's not a space.
um,
It's just like Earth. You could fit many Earths and Earths and Earths. It's just like, yeah. Space is again, and it's like again, and 1,000 years, by the way, is like the like optimistic where it's like somehow we've
yeah.
built like sort
Yeah.
of like a
Yeah.
Dyson sphere like
Yeah.
thing around the Earth. I mean, you're talking about some like sci-fi vision where it's like at that point there need to be probably like a trillion humans in order to even like build something that large. It's just like it's just inconceivably beyond what we're capable of. But in theory, exponential growth, if it continues for the next 1,000 years, that'll probably be roughly when we're able to build something like that.
Brilliant. So, what's your sci-fi vision of space exploration? I mean, it seems your company is the first one that makes me think like, oh, that feels like the next step to asteroid mining. Asteroid mining feels like the next step towards space colonization. On that space colonization, do you entertain kind of thoughts over with whether it's the moon, Mars, or space station as a habitation?
I think my primary lens has been, and part of why we started Varda is that, ultimately that type of, let's say, colonization needs to happen due to economic,
Yep.
activity.
Yep.
And I believe that,
Mm.
sort of the in-space manufacturing that Varda does is that very first step towards that type of economic activity. Um, and so I feel confident in saying that I think the first time that there will be 10 plus humans, living away from Earth that aren't basically just astronauts is likely going to look like a sort of space station that is attached to a pharmaceutical manufacturing facility, basically like ours. Almost certainly the second location for that is going to be, on the lunar surface, where likely a significant portion of that business will be sending materials from the lunar surface, to
Ooh.
facilities like ours to large satellites that are operating, given that basically the gravity well of the moon is much smaller, and so it's a lot easier to actually, counterintuitively, it's actually a lot easier to move materials from the moon
Oh.
into Earth's orbit versus from the Earth into Earth's orbit. And so, for example, if you want to refuel Starlink satellites, it's actually a lot easier to send that fuel from the moon than from Earth. Or even manufacture Starlink satellites over time. Obviously, that'll take some time, but sort of raw materials will probably be the first thing if they don't require a ton of sort of post processing. Although people are already talking about sort of building. There's some companies that have demonstrated building solar panels from like lunar regolith.
Wait,
But yeah,
can
almost certainly, I'm more of a believer in. I think the economic activity is going to be what drives colonization, and so I'm a little more skeptical of like the sort of let's say sort of Mars plan in the sort of near term, not necessarily in the long term. In that, I just think we have so much more that we need to develop in terms of the low Earth orbit, lunar, sort of economies to become really well established before humanity can support, sort of a Mars, sort of colony. And I think it's been at least important. My life's work is to, I think, sort of focus on that, sort of near term economic activity, because I think actually that is the thing that makes the longer term, sort of colony more possible.
can we manufacture propulsion inside of space? I mean, you mentioned solar panels on the moon. Like, what are the things that, because how, if you got it to the moon, you'd have to get it from the Earth, unless there's some way to build propulsion
Um,
inside.
I mean, the idea is basically you bring some equipment to the moon, and then that equipment is now capable of using raw materials from the moon to manufacture things like solar
Oh, got
panels,
it. Got it. Okay,
like
great.
propulsion,
And so
etc. Um,
is there any economic activity that can be done in the moon on the moon itself? Like, does the moon offer any sort of
Oh, lots. Yeah. I mean, again, it'll take some time to get there. And that I always tell people, even if you had somebody that had set up a lunar ice mining operation today, it's not clear where they're sending that water because there's not companies like Varda or Impulse Space, one of our other portfolio companies that have succeeded enough yet that are demanding water. But as you see things like Varda, Impulse, and others succeed, we are going to be consuming so much water regularly for our production, for our propulsion, that it will make more sense to, rather than constantly shipping that up from the Earth, instead get that from the moon. And so, yeah, there's water, there's raw materials, there's helium-3, which has some nuclear relevancy.
Oh,
If you look at sort of the moon's crust, it actually sort of shares a lot of geological elements similar to the Earth, but with no tectonic activity. And so because of that, you'll see a lot, you should see a much higher preponderance of a lot of rare earth minerals, but at the very surface. And so yeah, there's a ton of economic sort of value from the moon. Just it's one of these things where it's a question of sequencing of sort of when does that become economically viable.
Okay. Raw materials, helium-3, rare earth materials. What besides the rare earth materials and the helium-3, are there any other raw materials up there?
I think it's still underexplored in some ways geologically. So those are the things that we like know are guaranteed. But yeah, basically water, ice, regolith, which can be used to build large scale metal structures in orbit. Obviously propulsion uses for water, and then yeah, almost certainly a decent number of rare earth minerals.
Cool. Have you ever heard? I interviewed Ash Jokalaker the other day, and Ash studied under Freeman Dyson, and we had an amazing
Oh,
conversation
cool.
about Freeman Dyson. And like, of all the people in history, he's like top 10 of people I would have liked to have met before he passed. Uh, Particularly for this next idea, which I'm going to explain, which you may have heard of, may not have heard of, which is that he worked out all the math and all the physics to like what's the best form of propulsion. And he said the best form of propulsion, once you get out, past a certain distance, likely one of those distances we were talking about earlier, the Langrian or
Lagrangian.
Lagrangian. And once you get past one of those, then you start dropping nuclear bombs and exploding them and propelling you faster and faster and faster. Have you heard of this before?
Yeah, I think we've come up with better sort of since then, but yes, yeah, familiar with his work.
Oh, okay. Well, so let's go into propulsion. It would be fun to talk about that. What are the better forms of propulsion that we've discovered? Like, what are the latest things? Are there any technologies that startups are building? Are there any startups that we should be paying attention to that are building propulsion systems?
Yeah, when you think about propulsion, there's sort of sort of two key components to it.
Mm.
The first is ultimately you're governed by sort of the laws of physics, in that the thing that is moving you has to move equally in the opposite direction, basically. And so what matters is two basically key factors. One, how quickly do you shoot out the thing basically that you're moving behind you, and then two, how much of it can you shoot out at once.
Mm.
I think it's been sort of pretty well proven at this point that the easiest way or best way to move things sort of very very quickly is to have basically positively or negatively charged basically ionized particles, so they have a electrical charge, and then you use the electromagnetic force through the equivalent of, think of like a rail gun basically, to shoot those ions out sort of very quickly. And so that's what's known as electric propulsion basically today, and people have done this with like ion engines. The issue with those to date has been that they really only shoot out, basically think of it as like individual ions at a time, and so they can't really shoot out a whole lot of them basically at once. But if you think about sort of why, it's mostly because if you bring a bunch of ionized particles basically together that are super sort of high energy, they form what's known as this fourth state of matter, which is sort of plasma, which is traditionally a very difficult sort of thing to control. But from a first principles basis, if one could control a bunch of ions all together at once and you shoot them out very quickly, well, now you both have things that move very quickly, but also you're moving a bunch of them at once, which is a little bit closer to basically like a rocket engine, or what you were mentioning, this type of sort of nuclear propulsion. I only know of really one company in the world working on this approach. It's a portfolio company actually that I invested in called MagDrive, that I believe, and again, it's still got a lot of sort of technical burn down, but we should be doing our first in-flight demonstration potentially later this year, which I think could have sort of significant implications for what the future of spaceflight looks like, and they have a long ways to scale. But in theory, that type of propulsion system is what would allow you and I to take something that is roughly the sort of size of a car and fill it up with a tank of quote unquote sort of gas, and actually be able to take that from the surface of the Earth all the way to orbit. That'll take some time, but that is not sort of totally impossible. The next step after that would be what are traditionally known as sort of warp drives, where if we basically find a way to actually sort of manipulate the space-time continuum and basically shrink and pull together the space-time continuum in front of a vehicle such that it basically falls into it, you can actually use that in a basically propulsionless technology to move about the universe. So those are, at least from my understanding of sort of physics, and I believe are generally the globally understood laws of physics. Those are sort of the two I think most promising, let's say, sort of technologies in the future. When people now talk, in relation to sort of nuclear, based propulsion, now nuclear is more used as the power plant, more so than necessarily the actual means of propulsion, and that obviously that electromagnetic force requires power. In some ways, you can always sort of break this stuff down to there's really only sort of four forces in the universe, right? It's gravity, weak and strong nuclear force, and then electromagnetic force. Historically, in some ways, gravity would basically be the warp drive, right? Using that, we don't yet know how to manipulate gravity. I always give the analogy to people, if you remember the 2018, I want to say, gravity wave experiment at MIT, where they basically showed that they could measure gravity waves. Basically, there was a supernova across the universe. It actually rippled through the space-time continuum because it had such powerful energy waves, and it actually affected the distance of a tunnel underneath MIT. And so normally that tunnel has a normal distance, and it actually, you could see the reverberation of the space-time continuum actually in that tunnel. That's like us as cavemen seeing light for the first time, and you're asking me when is that caveman going to be able to flash a flashlight so that they can control the light rather than just see it? We probably got a little ways to go to making that flashlight. Could be 1,000 years, could be 1,000,000 years, but we did observe at least, ripples in the space-time continuum. Now the question is, can we cause those ripples intentionally? Anyway, so that's gravity. For a long time, obviously, all propulsion was based off the strong and weak nuclear force, basically chemical reactions, creating, sort of combustion. And then, ion engines are basically using that sort of magnetic force. And obviously, in theory, the better version of the electromagnetic force is, again, not one ion at a time, but many ions at a time. So in some ways, the laws of physics kind of constrains you to how do you want to move in the universe.
It's so interesting. This could get philosophical very quickly. I've been thinking about this thing that I think it was a scientist I recently read talking about how the certain way that our universe is set up is just, and I don't mean to sound anthropomorphic, but is that it's set up in a way that is like the fact that there's these various things that allow us to discover fire and then manipulate fire, and like now we can do all these things with fire, or like it just seems like really both weird and beautiful and like it's a gift. And what's your take on that? Do you think there is that creative intelligence there, or what's your take on that?
I generally agree with the take. I'm not sure that I'm one to, sort of opine on, let's say, the, lack of or existence of, sort of, proactive creator behind it. But yeah, there's, I think, a lot of, things that are very fortuitous that led to, sort of life here on Earth. As one very practical example, I think, I forget the exact number, but I think it's roughly, if the Earth was actually about 40% larger by mass, all of our current basically chemical rocketry would not be able to actually get us into orbit. And so if we lived on a slightly larger planet, basically, we probably would not be in space today, and it might take us actually a significantly, basically longer time to actually figure out how to, get to orbit. The fact that we have, if you study a lot of the, sort of Goldilocks, sort of exoplanets that we've, found, the Earth is one of the very few that actually has such a large, basically, satellite. When I say satellite, I basically mean the moon, that has such a large satellite that is so close to the actual, sun that it orbits around. If you look at most other, sort of systems, you will have large gas giants further out into the system, like we do with Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, etc. Those typically do have many satellites and many moons that obviously, are not typically that large relative to the gas giant, but can be, generally, relatively large. But to have something that is really the size of the moon so close to us, I think it seems like very, very rare in the universe. And I believe is likely one of the causes for why there's sort of life on Earth is the moon acting as a somewhat of a shield or a disturbance in asteroids that would have otherwise sort of hit the Earth, in that it just gave us on average more time between asteroid hits for life to get sort of further along. Obviously, it's been sort of asteroids have been the sort of major extinction events on the Earth sort of many times. But it maybe significantly decreased the frequency enough that it allowed for carbon-based life forms to have more time to evolve and survive between these. And so, yeah, I think there's just a lot of things about obviously the general laws of the universe, but then also I think very specifically our home here on Earth that make it a very sort of special place that allows the universe for the first time to sort of look at itself. That some people might find some creative intelligence behind. I find it very poetic, maybe sometimes in a sad way, where the universe can finally look at itself and realize how entropic it is. Unfortunately, by looking at oneself, one also realizes that one does not get to look at oneself indefinitely.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, that the observer goes away. Yeah, well, this gets into the quantum stuff as well. I just find it so interesting that the quantum mechanics basically, I'm no expert in this, but I've interviewed a lot of people on it, and it's the from like Galileo until until Einstein. And I mean, even Einstein didn't like the spooky action at a distance,
Yep.
the quantum entanglement. Until that time, everybody, like, science destroyed philosophy because it basically said there is no God. Like life, like all these planets are deterministic. It's all according to divine laws. There is no creator. That's just it's just all function like clockwork. And then I think it was Bohr, some one of the guys, maybe Schrodinger, started to do these experiments, and he said, okay, well, yeah, at the big level, it's all deterministic, but at this little tiny little level, it's all probabilistic. And like you, until you observe that electron is not in physical space. It's and any, that's in a proportion. There's it could be at any points in this line, and so at that level, it's not deterministic. And I mentioned this to Ash in our email, in our podcast, and he said, yes, that's true, but also those proportions of the electron are all knowable. So it's all deterministic, but the probabilities are still probabilistic, but the rules are all deterministic.
The
Um,
indeterminism is deterministic.
yeah, ooh, that's cool. And so I forget my original point, well, okay, yeah. So going back to Varda, going back to propulsion or anything in space, how has the actual applied sciences of quantum mechanics influenced any of the technologies that you're doing, if at all?
I don't think that. Yeah, I don't think we have anything
Yeah,
that has been influenced by it. Yeah.
because the semiconductor is, so the semiconductor does have some things that have been benefited by quantum mechanics. And I'm just have a curiosity as to, like, what are the other technologies that are in this world. How are you guys using LLMs or computer vision at all in any of your projects? Maybe even just to do the knowledge work required by these things. Are any of your engineers using it at all?
Not quite yet. I think over time, that may increase, especially, right now our pharmaceutical laboratories have relatively limited, what's known as instrumentation. Basically, think of it as
Mm.
like instruments that read what's happening inside. Over
Oh,
time, as we start to, introduce, sort of computer vision into, sort of the vehicle, obviously that will feed us, sort of data that will, potentially, yeah, apply some intelligence onto to figure out how to maybe redo the, sort of reaction or adjust for the sort of future runs. But yeah, to date, still nothing in the world of, let's say, intelligence.
hmm. Anything helping with the knowledge work, like programming? Like, is there a lot of programming that needs to be done? Is that in-house, or do you guys contract that out?
Yeah, we have a very sort of stacked sort of software team, and obviously a lot of what we try to do is shift away from this world of sort of call manual control to more autonomous sort of
Yeah,
systems, and
got it.
so tons of software that goes into it. I wouldn't say that there's. I'm sure some of the engineers use Copilot and things like that, but I wouldn't say
Mm.
there's yet a ton of AI feeding into sort of that. Again, yet I think that will sort of shift over time, but for
Yeah,
now.
yeah, super interesting. I had a great question. Oh, okay, yeah. So you're building autonomous systems. There are no humans. I imagine there's no manned space flights. All autonomous up there. Is that right?
For now, the
Yeah.
eventual
Okay.
goal is, we do want to, get these laboratories that are autonomous large enough that eventually one can actually justify the basically marginal, sort of cost of having a human on board because of the marginal benefit of, maintaining those. And so part of why, we started Varda is the one-liner mission is to expand the economic bounds of humankind, right? And that second part is a critical part of the future vision. We're not working on humans today, but that's specifically because we're trying to set up this economic activity in the most cost-effective way so that we can get to the scale to justify more humans on board. And so I really believe that the way that there's going to be 100 plus humans in orbit is not going to be because of things like private space stations or because of space tourism. It's
Yeah,
ultimately
interesting.
going to be because of economic activity like ours. And so we need to really obsess about how we sort of build this up in the most cost-effective manner so that we can succeed in having 100 plus humans one day up there.
That's so cool. So now I'd like to go into, because you have a history as an investor as well, and one thing I've noticed with the LLMs is
Hopefully
that
history and future.
and future. And so one of the things I've noticed about LLMs is that a lot of people are moving in a lot of investors are moving into your field basically, or other deep tech or hard tech fields. And you have special insight into this thing. So is there any like things we should pay attention to in terms of these deep tech companies or hard tech companies that are, or like maybe not even companies, but I would love to hear them so I can interview them as well. But like the kind of like what are the principles that you're most excited about deep tech and hard tech that are going to be the most applicable in your understanding?
Yeah, I do think it's that just the world of real world innovation is getting a lot more attention
Mm,
from basically engineers, and in particular the like inputs into that, and that there's so much more software tooling and automation built into how one builds things in the physical world that it just makes iteration cycles so much sort of faster, right? Things like metal 3D printing, having started a decade ago, are now finally at the sort of scale where they can do almost any geometry and can actually be relevant for sort of production. There's just so much that just didn't exist a decade ago that now helps the real world engineering happen much faster in a much more autonomous sort of way. So yeah, I think that plus some of the, let's say, like geopolitical risks and reshoring of manufacturing in the United States. I think it's just like people have recognized that this like deindustrialization trend was actually a terrible idea. And so if you look at the amount of investment into sort of reshoring a ton of manufacturing and assembly, it's just massive in the United States. And I think that obviously has a sort of ton of sort of benefit to the disruptors more so than the incumbents. And so yeah, I don't know. There's a ton of different trends that I'm thrilled by. The increasing performance of the various sort of materials and inputs, whether it's sort of battery energy density, compute, all these things continue to improve, and these things sort of feed upon themselves. Where it's like better batteries means sort of better drones and capabilities, which means more markets for those, which means more investment into batteries, and even better batteries mean more cars that are electric and more drones that are electric. And so all this stuff, all these flywheels are just like spinning up exponentially that keep enabling these net new use cases. And then again, same thing in space. It's like the more launches there are, the more business models that can succeed with cheaper cost orbit, but that makes even more launch demand. And so there's just so many of these flywheels that sort of are spinning up exponentially, similar to what you saw in like the internet world, where it sort of exploded overnight. I think you're starting to see that more and more in the sort of physical world.
okay, yeah, that was a lot. Um, let's go into like why space? Why for you is space so important? Like because you before we started recording, was listening to another podcast where you were mentioning how you really wanted to work at JPL. And that must have been pretty early on. What kind of drew you to space?
Hard to say. It was like when I was like a sort of little kid. I think it was just like inspiring to sort of see the days of the shuttle and read and learn about the Apollo era. And I think it was one of these things where I don't know, just wanted to be the intrepid explorer, and what better final frontier than space itself. And so it's one of these things that's just been like a lifelong obsession, and now turned into sort of a sort of professional career. But I love this, sort of love this world. And, I'm so thrilled that I get to now, sort of contribute to it in a practical way rather than just being a fan from afar.
And so will you go up into space? Like when are you going to be one of the first people to go up there to the lab once it's you can go up there?
That's the hope. I actually told my, girlfriend at the time, now wife, on our very basically first date, that if she wanted to date me seriously, she had to be comfortable with the idea of coming to orbit with me. And at the time, she was like, "Oh, this is a whatever cute San Francisco tech nerd. Obviously, no reason to take him seriously." And then, as the company has succeeded, as we've made it further along, I think she's starting to realize that I was pretty serious about this endeavor.
Wow. I think about it a lot, like just like would I go to Mars? Would I go to the moon? And it's funny because I hate flying in airplanes, and I imagine that I would also hate flying in a space rocket. But then it's
It's
like,
definitely going to be even more chaotic. So
yeah,
but
more
I think
chaotic,
it'll
more
get comfortable over time.
well, and that could be a potential avenue for discussion about like how dangerous it is for humans to go into space compared to aircraft. But there's also this thing about uh the it's like an emotional thing of like if you the goal that you have needs to be more important than whatever fear that you have around that goal. So for like space, like some people don't have it. Some people have it like just like for some reason in their matrix, they've not they're not afraid of certain things that cause vast majority of other people to be afraid. But fear of flying is a common one, and fear of going to space is probably going to be a very very common one as well. Yeah, if you have any takes on that, I'd love to hear them. Otherwise, we can go into that question about how dangerous it is.
Yeah, I mean, I think look, it's going to be a very personal choice, and some people, again, you're going to have fear. Some people are going to have the sort of incentive that they want to go to orbit. I think it's one of these things where it's like it's going to look like the early days of commercial airlines, where for sure it was sort of dangerous early on, and then over the course of time, sort of got safer, and safer. Not to say there's almost certainly going to be fatalities in the early days of the commercialization of sort of space. But I think at any frontier, there's always basically more risk, but there's also a lot more reward.
Yep. Yeah, and that's the thing about I've been thinking a lot about the explorers, the early explorers who jumped on that boat, not knowing. I mean, there's so many people that just used to be a normal thing about life was just going and doing the thing, like going into the void and like, yeah, we're Jim, we're going back into the void. Let's do it and get on the boat and and then like 4 weeks later, you either sink or you find a tropical paradise. And it's just the nature of life, but that's like exciting. And now because we've extended life, well, we could talk about this too. Now because we've extended life, we're now like sort of more scared somehow of death. And like our comfort has changed our relationship to death in this really interesting way. But then yeah. We could last 5 minutes or so. We could talk about life extension. What's your take on the whole life extension thing going on? Do you think it's real? Do you think it's a hype?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a ton of different approaches, everything from sort of Bride Johnson's sort of blueprint stuff to sort of Celine at Loyal. I'm generally pro the field, and it's I think super exciting to see this stuff be more normalized. I'm not sure that I have sort of enough background or have spent enough time there to sort of validate sort of whose approach is sort of best or what the potential is. But I just think it's super exciting that people are sort of finally seriously investing in this and discussing it in a way that is no longer just like academic theory, but is people practically doing pharmaceutical product and sort of self-experimentation in a way that I think is pretty radical. And so yeah, I mean, as somebody who would love to live as long as possible, I'm very thrilled that some people are really making it their life's work to enable this type of stuff for the sort of rest of us, and hopefully get to take advantage of some of their work over the coming decades.
So you aren't like taking anything that might help you extend life. You haven't found anything like that.
For now, it's just that good old Bulgarian DNA. I think is gonna, let me, ride for a little while longer, and so I'm gonna do that, and then, hopefully, start to take advantage of some of these, sort of work, so people's work, as they get a little older.
And what about the Bulgarian yogurt? Is that part of it too?
Oh yeah, definitely part of the, sort of diet and part of the success.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. How can people find out more about Varda?
Probably easiest just our corporate Twitter. It's at Varda Space. We always announce all of our biggest activities there.
What's the name behind the name? What's the mythos behind the name, Varda?
So every Founders Fund incubation has been named after a Lord of the Rings name, and so as I was starting the company, I was basically looking for what in the anthology or stories of Lord of the Rings had some reference to space or manufacturing. And so in one of the like sort of side books, sub books as part of the universe, there's this elvish queen named Varda that would use the morning dew to make the stars in the sky. And so that was about as close as I could get to space manufacturing. And also the .com was available, and I kind of liked the name. So it's one of these things where it was like funny. I was like working on the project and I was like, I need a name today. And then 10 minutes later, I came up with Varda, and then the domain was available. I was like, cool, I'm done with the name, which is like never happened before to me in the history of all of my naming of projects. So probably a one-time thing. I don't know if I'll ever, knock it out of the park like that again.
Yeah. Kismet. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Sweet. Thanks so much for having me.